In this video, I'm going to turn the beloved Gen 1 starter Pokemon into immersive, fully animated 3D Pokemon cards. Each card is going to contain its own little world that you can look around in, complete with a unique environment and each Pokemon's specific attack. While this project seems easy enough, it's actually turned out to be one of the most difficult projects I've ever done. Oh, dude, I don't know, I need to take a break. I think I'm done for the day. You're not gonna wanna miss the final result though, so let's find out how we got there. Recently, a friend of mine told me about this mobile game called Pokemon TCG Pocket. They're not a sponsor of this video, though I wish, but some of these cards have these little animations which I think are pretty cool. These animations let you see into the card, but as I was looking at them, I realized it's really more of a transition into a 2.5D world that was just moving past static cutouts. That was cool and all, but really I wanted more. This is what I'm looking for. I want to be able to move the camera around and to be able to see around the corner of the card. And I want whatever is inside the card to have a bit of life to it. Sort of like looking through a glass barrier at the zoo. So, of course, I thought to myself, well, they didn't do it, but I can. So, I started by pulling card references of the starter Pokemon, since that's what will get me the most clicks on YouTube. Man, it's been such a long time since I've seen these old cards. And ooh, this Charmander is pretty cool. I'll grab that. I'm just gonna bring the card into Blender so that I can mock out the general shape. I tried to follow the various parts of the cards that seemed like they would be protruding off the card a bit, and I did my best to match the shape. It's not perfectly exact, but I figured that it was close enough, as more than likely you'd barely be looking at that part of the card anyway. I also added some little buttons for the element symbols that I had planned to make custom materials for later on. Once I had a decent build of the card, I brought that into Unreal Engine so that I would have something to reference as I built Charmander's world. I knew that this project was going to take quite a long time, so in hopes of actually being able to get this video out sooner, I decided to lean on some pre-made assets for the environment build. Luckily, at some point I'd gotten this stylized nature environment for free on the Epic Games Store and realized that it's actually kind of a perfect fit for the art style. Alright, so I'm gonna start building Charmander's little world. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a landscape, and then I'm just gonna use the landscape material we got from the stylized forest to give it a little bit of texture. The cool thing about this landscape material is that when you start to sculpt on the landscape, it kind of already adds textures where they need to go, and it adds some foliage, which is a nice touch too. I knew that I'd only really be seeing this part of the world, so I made sure to only worry about making things look right from the angle I thought you'd be able to see. From there, I just placed some rocks and trees and tried to make it look inviting. Now, I'll be honest, up to this point, I didn't really know how I was going to do all this. I had a rough idea of how I could, but boy, I really didn't have any clue how difficult all of this was gonna be. My first plan was just to scale down and attach my Charmander level to the card itself. You can probably see how this could work. When I move around next to the card, it does sort of create an effect like you're looking through the card, but obviously you can see the rest of the level that you aren't supposed to see, so I needed to mask that out. Now, I'm definitely more of an artist than a programmer. In fact, I would never insult programmers by calling myself a programmer, but based on some of the research I'd done, I learned that you can sometimes mask out objects by using something called a stencil buffer. I don't really know exactly what that is, but it's a fancy Unreal Engine thing that allows you to mask objects in real time. You can see a good example of it in action here, and honestly, after seeing stuff like this, I kind of thought that this would be super easy to do. In order to make this work though, every object that you want to be able to mask has to have a specific material. And once I learned about that, I realized the big problem. This method only works with materials that are considered transparent to Unreal Engine. This is fine for some things, but it doesn't really work with things like foliage or landscapes. So even though this method was promising, for our build, it wasn't gonna work. So, okay, back to the drawing board then. I had to scour the YouTube and Unreal Engine forums, but soon I discovered another method that could make this work: render targets. Imagine you have a camera pointed at something. Now you can create a texture from the output of that camera and put it in a material. That material can go on an object, and it's sort of like you have a little monitor or something. The only problem is that it doesn't really have the parallax we need. It doesn't look like you're looking through a window. It's sort of like you're looking at a screen. Well, that's because it's a 2D render target, but there's also a 3D render target that basically captures the world in a giant cube. This looks a bit better, but honestly, the scale is kind of weird, and wow, it really tanks the performance. These aren't really meant for real-time capture, and even though this is mostly for the video, I thought that maybe 3 of these things would just become so render intensive that I wouldn't really be able to work with it. So I kept looking for a solution, and I found something that was really gonna push my programming skills to the limit. Now, I try not to get too technical on these videos, but I think it's really important for you to understand what's going on here. So bear with me for just like 30 seconds while I explain. Remember that camera we were using for our render target? If you look at the object the render target is being projected on, it just sort of stays in place, which doesn't really look like what we're going for. But the magic is when you do a bunch of scripting in Blueprint to make that camera copy what the player camera's doing. It's basically like a portal. If the player camera goes right, the portal camera goes right relative to the portal. The result is that when you move around, the image on the card makes it seem like you are just looking through a portal or a window. It's honestly a really cool effect, and it took a lot of tweaking in Blueprint and a lot of trial and error to make this work. If this is something you're interested in learning more about, I'm gonna link to a tutorial down below that helped me a lot to get here. And honestly, if more people are interested, I could make a full in-depth guide and put that on my Patreon. Okay, now back to the thing. Since we finally have something that resembles what I was going for, it was time to get some freaking Pokemon in this Pokemon video. I'm already like 14 hours into this project at this point, so I decided to just download this pack from an artist that had made all the starters and had pre-rigged all of them. Weirdly enough though, the Charmander model he'd made had such a strange rig on it. This was a Blender file too, so I don't really know why it was like this. I tried to animate with it, but eventually I just gave up and decided to re-rig it myself. Okay, so for this animation, I want to start with him jumping up and down, and then he'll sort of do like a little loop. And then I want to have him do some fire breathing and then just loop that. So let's see if I can do that. Now, in the same way, I'm not the best programmer. I'm not the best animator either, but I think I do okay sometimes. I basically just animate a bunch of poses with constant keyframes, sort of like a stop motion animation. And once you have enough keyframes, you can let Blender calculate the in-betweens. He looks so derpy, dude. I feel like the cuteness factor really helps me a lot here. It's not the best, but with a little bit of tweaking, I think I can get it close. To be honest, I probably could have spent way more time animating Charmander, but I figured he'd be in some grass and I wanted to give him some fire breath, so my hope was that it would be good enough to move forward. My process philosophy is usually just to get it to a good place and then move on, knowing that I can always come back later and improve on it, so that's what I did. I imported his animation, and for the first time, I really got a sense of how it was gonna look, and I was actually kind of impressed with it. The animation was definitely a little jank, but it had sort of a charm to it, which gave me a lot of energy to keep going. One thing that I thought would make this really cool would be to simulate some fire for the fire breathing move. For that, I knew I could use Embergen, a super impressive real-time smoke and fire simulator. It looks kind of complicated, but it's actually pretty easy to make this work too. I made a plane, which I would use as the front of the card, as if he's blowing the fire against the window of it. Then I parented the fire emitter to his mouth and just keyframed the emission time to line up with his attack. Then once I got that looking pretty good, I just exported it as a VDB sequence and brought that into Unreal Engine. Now, out of the box, Unreal doesn't handle VDBs that well. At least the materials are never looking that good, but I found a free plugin for personal use from this company called Zebra VDB. It's basically a VDB compression plugin that also has some really nice shaders built into it. I just imported the fire through that plugin, put it in place, and watched as it perfectly looped with my Charmander animation. Once I had that in a good spot, I did the same thing for his tail, parenting the fire emitter to the bone at the tip of his tail. Now this was looking really good, so I decided to finish it off by making sure my card was fully textured. All I needed to do was map the UVs for each of these pieces of the card, create a little gem for the element buttons, and import those into Unreal. The last thing is we need to put the back on it. It's a little weird because the card is 3D and the back is 2D, so it doesn't fully line up because there's a little bit of an edge, but I'm okay with that, and I think you're only gonna see it like once in the final thing, so I'm not too worried about it. I decided to take a nice little stroll to admire my handiwork on what would basically be a 95% complete Charmander card. While I was at it, I decided to finish out the textures for the other two cards as well. Now, I did cheat a little at this point though. Originally, the cards I was using as reference were not at all from the same design, so I went back and found other cards for Bulbasaur and Squirtle that use the same basic layout for their cards. This saved me a bunch of time not having to remodel the other two cards, as I could just reuse the same geometry. Plus, it was kind of nice because it made them feel more like a set anyways, so win-win. Once I had my 3 cards ready to go, it was time to move on to the next Pokemon animation, Squirtle. For this little turtle boy, I used the same model from the set I had downloaded previously, though this one had a slightly better rig, so I felt like I could get away with animating without re-rigging. My plan was to just have him swim around in some water, and then have the water ripple as he swam through it. So I did a little blender magic and animated Squirtle swimming around in a circle around this plane. It's actually really satisfying to watch as the physics is just plain awesome, no pun intended. Plus, I was gonna get the added benefit of all this being calculated beforehand, so it should help my performance a little bit in Unreal. So I exported both the Squirtle animation and the rippled plane as an Alembic cache and imported that into Unreal. The only problem was Unreal Engine had other plans. Whoa, what? Okay, hold on, I think I did something wrong. If you look, it looks right in the preview window, but in the actual render, something's wrong with it. I suspect it's like a lumen thing, but I honestly don't know. Most of the documentation I found online, like no one's talking about this. For some reason, despite looking perfect in the preview, Unreal Engine could not figure out how to render the water. Even when I gave it just a normal solid material, it had this crazy visual. I still have not figured out why this happened. I spent an entire day troubleshooting this. I cut most of this out, but there's literally hours of me trying so many different things trying to get this to work. Eventually though, I decided to just try to use the water simulations inside Unreal Engine and just do it in real time. From what I can tell, these aren't quite as sophisticated as what I can do in Blender, or at least they aren't as high quality, but I was able to get a pretty decent looking simulation going using the Niagara system that comes pre-built in the engine. I was generally pretty happy with this result, but during the process, I poked my camera under the water and realized that this perspective was actually cooler than the one I had initially planned, which basically made all that work I did before pointless, but it's part of the process, so I guess it's fine. From there, I just finished it out with some more foliage and rocks and dropped it into my main world where the other cards were living. The only thing left to do was to finish setting up my render targets and bask in the glow of my finished Squirtle card. Okay, yeah, so it looks really bad. Honestly, I shouldn't be surprised at this point. One of the reasons the underwater view looked cool was because it had a post-process volume on it, which basically is just a big cube with some render settings that's doing a bunch of color correction under the hood. But for some reason, don't know why, render targets override post-process volumes, and because of the way that I set up my blueprint, I couldn't really tweak the exposure settings on my render targets that easily since they were being generated when I ran the game. So I tried to manually recreate this look using some shadows and lighting happening in the actual level, and I got it looking okay. Don't get me wrong, it definitely works as intended, but it looked much cooler in my head. This isn't my favorite, but please just bear with me. I do end up reworking this, and it looks a lot cooler in the end. But for now, let's go check out Bulbasaur and see what he's up to. So this Bulby had a different rig than the other two as well, and he had a bunch of animations that actually were really nice. I was feeling pretty defeated from how Squirtle turned out, so I decided to utilize the animations that were already here and just string them together in Blender's nonlinear editor. Basically, this is where you use a bunch of shorter animation clips and blend them together. I thought it would be kind of cute to have him vine whipping this apple for some reason, so I animated those actions together and then just animated the apple flying across the space. Once I got that to a place that felt pretty good, I brought him into Unreal and started building his little world that would exist around him. I wanted to put him into a bit of a thicker forest, so I added lots of trees behind him, and I placed some near him to create some breakup of the light. I also added some light specific to his scene that would help him pop out a little better. I tried to test how this was going to look back at my 3-card lineup, but here's where 3 render targets being operated simultaneously really started to hurt my performance. Even at like the lowest scalability settings on the graphics, I was getting like 10 FPS, very much not ideal for finishing this thing out. I thought maybe I just had too many trees in the Bulbasaur scene, so I tried to make them utilize Nanite in hopes of speeding up performance a bit. Now, I've talked about this before, but basically Nanite is Unreal's super magical spell that makes it so that you can render a gazillion polygons at basically no cost to the GPU. Well, after I did that, technically it improved my performance, but the trees started doing this. And honestly, I was just not patient enough to deal with it, so I swapped it back to normal and decided that I had had enough of Unreal Engine for the day. The next day, after a bit of watching my girlfriend play the new Pokemon game, I realized that bad graphics are actually okay and people will love it anyways just because it's Pokemon. So I decided to keep moving forward on my project. I had this idea that the final renders would take place in a normal home, as I thought the cards would have a more striking appearance juxtaposed against this normal apartment aesthetic. I think I bought this apartment set a long time ago for another project, so I decided to throw that in there to serve as the backdrop for my cards. I positioned my cards on this little table here and did some lighting to set the mood. Then I set up my camera, did a bit of animation, and hit render. Oh. Bro, it looks so bad. Damn it. This looks so bad, dude. I don't know, like I've spent so much time on this and clearly has something to do with like maybe it's like the field of view of the cameras. I don't know, I feel like I need to keep tweaking it. I gotta figure out how to solve this problem because I've come this far, like I can't just stop. I don't know, I need to take a break. I think I'm done for the day. I'm gonna come back tomorrow and try and like work on this. I don't know. This was absolutely devastating. I just kept hitting setback after setback. Perhaps I'd been too ambitious. Maybe I was naive thinking I could just jump into something without truly understanding what I was doing. After all, most of my experience in Unreal is rendering cinematics that don't really require anything to actually be running in the game. For 2 days, I beat my head against the wall, trying different methods, experimenting with my blueprint logic to try and solve the puzzle of why this looks so bad. But no matter what I did, nothing worked. It seemed like I was never gonna figure it out. It slowly started to dawn on me that it was true. I was a fraud, a no-talent hack. Indeed, I was never gonna be anything more than a teeny tiny small YouTuber. And then, in my darkest moment, a light shined down from the heavens, like a sign from Tim Sweeney. Small. I have to be small. Well, technically I needed to make the portals and the cards bigger and the environment smaller. Due to math reasons that I'm not really gonna get into, making the apartment scene and the cards a bit bigger gave me more room to play with in terms of field of view. Now, moving say 30 units in Unreal Engine would cover way less ground inside the world on the other side. In hindsight, it was actually kind of obvious that it was this way. When I was mocking all this up, the cards were way bigger, but when I shrunk them down, it kind of broke everything. But sometimes you just can't see the forest for the trees. With this new realization, I finally had the confidence I needed to get this thing to the finish line. I was still dealing with the issues in Squirtle Land, so I decided to just scrap the whole thing and start over. It turns out that the Squirtle asset actually had some pretty decent animations baked into it as well. So I did the same thing I did with Bulbasaur, and I just blended those animations together with the intent of making him do a little bubble blast. Once I got that animation into Unreal, I just used Unreal Engine's built-in particle system to make a little bubble simulation. Gave him a little rock island to stand on, and he was finally looking like the Squirtle he was always meant to be. Like I said, this is obviously the way I should have done it to start with, but forest trees, you get it. And with that, I finished out my little set, including scattering a few cards and throwing in a Pokeball, and we were done. Through all that hard work, I finally had something amazing that honestly I'm really proud of. So without further ado, it's time to see the final thing.